The diner had the smell of burnt coffee and sizzling bacon, a stale aroma that clung to the air like a memory that wouldn't fade. It was the usual rush hour, the counter buzzing with chatter, the clink of plates being stacked, the hiss of the grill. Yet amidst the chaotic hum of the morning, there was a single figure who stood out, not by making a scene, but by her silence. Denise Carter's movements were deliberate, precise, as she balanced trays with one hand while the other, wrapped in white bandages, hung limp by her side. Her good hand gripped a steaming mug, her eyes steady, unwavering, as she moved from table to table. The left hand, her injured hand, was stiff, but she carried on with a quiet grace. The bandages stretched from her wrist up to her elbow, and if you watched closely enough, you could see her wince slightly when her fingers brushed against something too close. Her uniform was worn, her apron stained from the constant work. But there was something about her, a quiet strength, an unspoken resilience. Most of the customers didn't notice it. They saw a waitress, just another woman in the back of the diner, hustling to keep everything running. But Denise was more than that. She had been more than that for years. Behind the counter, Ross, the manager, leaned with one hand on the register, barking orders. "Come on, Denise, keep it moving. You think I've got all day?" His voice cut through the air like a sharp blade, and his eyes were always on her, watching for the smallest mistake. When she stumbled, when she hesitated, he was there to remind her. His words sliced through the morning air. "We don't have time for your mistakes, Denise. Get it together." A few customers at the counter exchanged glances, whispering. "She shouldn't even be working with that hand," one of them murmured. "He's got it out for her. You see the way he treats her?" Another voice joined in, a hint of pity behind it. "Poor girl. She doesn't deserve this." Denise didn't acknowledge the whispers. She never did. Her face remained stoic, her eyes focused on the task at hand. But beneath the surface, a storm raged. Her left hand hurt more than she let on, the pain making every movement a struggle. Yet she moved through it, always keeping her composure. Because quitting wasn't an option. Not when bills needed to be paid and rent was due. Not when there was no one else to lean on. By mid-morning, the heat in the diner had grown unbearable. The sweat on her neck stung as it mixed with the old, familiar smell of grease and stale coffee. The pressure of carrying too much weight in just one arm was taking its toll. Her good arm ached, and her wrist throbbed with each movement. Then came the collision. A simple mistake. An accident. Denise, carrying a tray, turned just as Ross stepped into her path. The tray slipped, sending a glass of water splashing across his shirt. The noise that followed echoed through the diner, silencing everything for a moment. Ross's eyes locked onto hers, his expression tight with disdain. He leaned in close, his breath sour with the smell of stale coffee. "Clumsy again? You just looking for a reason to slow down?" His words were a whip, cracking through the silence. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A voice from the back of the room muttered, "Give her a break." But Ross wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on Denise, his gaze a cold, calculated assessment. He wasn't angry about the spill. No, this was about control. Denise lowered her gaze, murmuring an apology as she reached for a towel with her good hand. But before she could grab it, Ross snatched it from her fingers, a twisted smile forming on his lips. She could feel the weight of his presence, his dominance in that moment. She wasn't just clumsy, she was a target. Weeks ago, when Denise had been cleaning up after the dinner rush, she had overheard something she wasn't supposed to hear. Ross had been bragging, his voice low but unmistakable. He was stealing from the register, pocketing cash. It wasn't just an accident. He had done it for months, and now, with her injury, Denise had become his scapegoat. The pain from her broken wrist had been nothing compared to the terror of knowing what Ross was capable of. When he'd caught her listening in that night, he had twisted her wrist with force, sending her to the ground. "You keep your mouth shut, Denise," he had warned, his voice cold, menacing. "Or I'll make sure you regret it." She hadn't spoken a word to anyone, and now, with her injury, Ross had the perfect excuse to label her incompetent, to build the case that she was nothing but a liability. But today, something was different. At the far corner of the diner, Harold Whitman sat, his eyes fixed on Denise. He had been watching her for weeks now. From his usual booth in the corner, Harold had seen it all. How she worked harder than anyone else, how she kept going even when she was targeted by Ross. He had seen the way the manager treated her, the way he found fault in everything she did. And he had noticed the bandages on her wrist, the way she carried herself with a quiet dignity despite the pain. Harold wasn't just another customer. He was the owner of the diner. For years, he had watched from the shadows, keeping his identity hidden. But today, something in the way Denise carried herself made him decide it was time to act. Harold had seen injustice before. He had been a soldier in a war, and he had fought for the things that mattered. But here, in his own diner, he had found something far worse than war. He had found a woman who had been broken by the very people who should have protected her, and that was something he could not stand. As the lunch crowd started to thin out, Harold made his move. He waited for Ross to walk past his booth, his hands folded on the table, his face set in a quiet determination. Ross didn't notice him at first, but when he did, the grin faltered. Harold's voice was calm, but firm. "I've been watching you, Ross," he said, his eyes narrowing. "I know what you've been doing." Ross's face drained of color. His bravado wavered, and for the first time, he looked unsure. "What are you talking about?" Harold stood, taking a slow step toward the counter. "You're finished here." The room seemed to hold its breath. The weight of his words hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud, and for the first time, Denise felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. The first step had been taken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after Harold's revelation, the diner felt different. The clatter of dishes was louder, the laughter of the regulars less sincere, the smell of burnt coffee and grease more oppressive. It was as though the air itself had shifted, heavy with anticipation and unspoken tension. Denise moved through it, her movements automatic, yet there was a subtle change. She was no longer just the waitress, the invisible one who had been pushed and pulled at the whims of others. No, today she was something else. She walked with a slight straightening of her shoulders, as though the weight she had carried for years had lightened, even if just for a moment. Ross was noticeably absent. It was rare for the manager to not be on the floor during the busy hours, but Harold had made sure of that. After the confrontation yesterday, Ross had been called into the back office, and from the look on his face when he walked out, it was clear he had been stripped of more than just his power. "Do you need any help?" a voice broke through her thoughts. Denise turned to see Tom, one of the regulars at the counter, his eyes kind and a little more concerned than usual. She smiled, but it was a strained smile, one she wasn't used to showing. "No, I've got it. Thanks, though." Tom nodded, but his eyes lingered a bit longer than necessary. He had seen the way Ross treated her, how Denise had been nothing more than a target for his cruelty. He had heard the rumors, the whispers. Now he could see it for himself. At the counter, Harold sat as usual, his coffee mug in front of him, steam rising from the cup. His eyes tracked every movement in the diner, a quiet observer, but there was something different in his gaze today. He was no longer just watching. He was waiting for the moment when the truth would surface, when things would unravel the way they always do when something hidden is exposed. Denise's heart thudded quietly in her chest as she passed by him. She knew he had seen everything. He had watched Ross, watched her. She didn't know why he had stepped in yesterday, why he had chosen this moment to act, but a part of her was grateful. The other part, however, felt exposed, like her wounds, long buried, had been dragged into the light. As the lunch crowd came and went, Denise's eyes darted to the back office door every now and then. It was closed, but she knew what was happening behind it. Harold had brought the truth to light. Ross had been caught. But what now? What did it mean for her? Her gaze drifted toward the counter again, and this time Harold's eyes were on her. His gaze was steady, unyielding, and for the first time, she found herself meeting it. Not in defiance, but with a quiet understanding. It was almost as if he could read her thoughts. Or perhaps it was just the weight of his quiet observation that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. The door to the back office opened suddenly, and Ross stepped out. His face was pale, his eyes wild. But there was a nervous energy to him now, a franticness that hadn't been there before. He was a man who had lost control, a man who had underestimated the quiet strength of those he thought he could break. He looked around the diner, but his eyes didn't meet Denise's. Instead, they fell on Harold, who remained seated, calm and unwavering. Ross swallowed hard. This isn't over, you hear me? He spat, though his voice trembled. You think you've won? You're wrong. Harold didn't react. He didn't have to. His silence, his refusal to rise to Ross's threats, spoke louder than any words could. Denise's heart quickened. She had heard Ross's words before, but there was something different in them now. The venom in his voice was the same, but the power was gone. It was a desperate, hollow threat. Harold's voice cut through the tension. No, Ross. It's over. The words landed with the finality of a hammer striking an anvil, and for a moment, the world outside the diner seemed to freeze. The chatter at the counter, the clinking of silverware, all of it stilled, suspended in time. Denise's breath caught in her throat. She had been so used to running from the weight of this place, the judgment, the exhaustion, the fear. But today, as she stood there, her hand still wrapped in bandages, she realized something. She had never truly been alone. Ross's shoulders slumped, his bravado shattered. He turned and made his way toward the door, each step heavier than the last. The sound of the door closing behind him felt like the final chapter closing on a story that had lasted far too long. The diner was still. The air felt lighter, and for the first time in a long time, Denise didn't feel the need to shrink. The customers, who had been silent during the exchange, slowly began to murmur. A few nodded toward Denise, their expressions softening. A few others glanced at Harold, a mixture of surprise and understanding in their eyes. But for Denise, it was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment of recognition. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She wasn't just the woman who had been wronged. She was someone who had stood up, quietly, but undeniably, and she had been seen. Harold's voice broke through the quiet once more. I think it's time, he said, his tone gentle but firm. Denise turned toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. Time for what? For you to move up. You've earned it, he replied, his gaze unwavering. Starting today, you're the new floor supervisor. Her chest tightened. She opened her mouth to speak, but found that the words caught in her throat. All she could do was nod. The room seemed to hum with a new energy, a quiet reverence for what had just happened. And for Denise, it was the first time in a long time that she felt like she truly belonged. But as she stepped behind the counter, taking on her new role, she knew that this was just the beginning. She had fought for recognition, for respect, and now she had earned it. The day after Ross's departure, the diner had a new rhythm. The bustle of plates, the clinking of silverware, the hum of chatter. It was all the same, yet it felt different, lighter, more hopeful. But beneath the surface of that hope, Denise felt something unfamiliar stirring. It was the weight of change, the realization that she was no longer just another waitress. She was something more now, but she wasn't sure yet what that looked like. The morning rush had come and gone, leaving the usual trail of dirty dishes and half-empty coffee cups behind. Denise moved around the diner with purpose, her bandaged hand now hidden beneath her apron, but her steps were steady. She no longer had to force the smile that came with the routine of it all. Now, it felt almost natural. As she wiped down the counter, her eyes flickered toward the booth where Harold sat. He was always there, his face unreadable, his presence steady, as if he had nothing to prove. She knew he wasn't just the owner. He was something more. Something that had been quietly watching, waiting for the right moment. The moment when the truth finally saw the light. Denise had never asked him why he had intervened the way he had. She didn't need to. She understood. He had seen her, even when no one else had. "How's it going, Denise?" came a voice from behind her. It was Tom, the regular who always sat at the counter. His voice was friendly, his eyes kind, though there was a hint of uncertainty there now. He had been watching the events unfold just like the rest of the diner's patrons, but now that the dust had settled, Denise could sense his hesitance. People were quick to show support when things were clear, but how long would that support last? How long before they returned to their comfortable indifference? "Good," she replied, her voice steady. "Busy, but good." Tom nodded, but his eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. "You know, I always thought you were doing more around here than anyone gave you credit for. Glad to see someone finally noticed." Denise smiled, though it felt more like a mask now. "Yeah, well, it's just how things go, isn't it?" The words were out before she could stop them. The resignation, the old familiar bitterness that she had carried for so long. But it was different now. She wasn't just accepting her place anymore. She wasn't willing to just blend into the background. "Not anymore," Tom said softly, his gaze flicking toward Harold's booth. "Seems like you're in charge now." The words hung in the air, and Denise felt her chest tighten at the thought. In charge. The phrase was foreign to her, like a coat that didn't quite fit. She had never asked for this responsibility, never expected it. And yet, now that it was here, she knew she couldn't step back. Denise nodded, her eyes flickering to the back office door. It was still closed. Ross was gone, but his shadow lingered in the corners of the diner, in the way the employees moved and spoke, in the way customers still whispered among themselves when they thought no one was listening. It was going to take more than just the removal of one man to change the dynamic of the diner. It was going to take time, and more than anything, it was going to take courage. "How's it feel?" Tom asked, as though sensing the conflict that played out in her mind. "Being the one who's finally seen?" Denise set the rag down with a soft sigh. She wiped her hands on her apron, her gaze distant. "It feels strange," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want it. But here I am. And now I have to make it work." Tom didn't respond right away. He let the silence stretch between them, filled only with the sounds of the diner around them. And then he said, "You'll make it work. You already have." The words settled into her chest, heavy with meaning. She wasn't sure if Tom knew how much they resonated with her, how much she needed to hear them. For years, she had worked hard, pushing through the pain, the injustice, never once stopping to ask for anything. And now, with everything changing, she had to learn how to ask, how to stand up for herself. Her gaze moved to Harold, who was still seated in his usual booth, sipping his coffee. His eyes were locked on her, and in that moment, it was as though he could see straight through her. Not just the waitress who had been hurt, but the woman beneath it all. The one who had always been there, even when no one had noticed. The bell above the door jingled, signaling the arrival of the next customer. It was a woman, dressed in a business suit, looking every bit the part of someone who had come to grab a quick bite before heading back to the office. She slid into a seat at the counter, her eyes flicking around as she settled in. Denise stepped forward, her posture straight, her movements calm. "What can I get for you today?" she asked, her voice steady, no hint of hesitation. The woman glanced up at her, then looked away, a faint smirk curling on her lips. "Just a coffee. Black." Denise nodded, moving to prepare the drink, her thoughts momentarily distracted by the woman's coldness. She had seen that look before, the one that said, "I know your place. I know you don't belong here." But Denise didn't flinch. She didn't retreat. Not anymore. As she placed the cup in front of the woman, their eyes met, and for a brief second, Denise saw something change. The woman's expression softened just a little, almost imperceptibly. Maybe it was the way she held herself now, stronger, more confident. Or maybe it was just that Denise had stopped apologizing for existing. Whatever it was, it made the woman pause for just a moment longer before turning away. And that was all Denise needed. She was no longer invisible. And that was the first step. Harold watched it all, his eyes unreadable. But somewhere deep in the lines of his face, there was something softer now, a sense of satisfaction. The diner was changing, and Denise was at the heart of it. As the day wore on, the diner grew quieter, the usual chaos of customers replaced by a slow, steady rhythm. Denise moved between tables, carrying herself with a quiet authority that had once been denied her. She was learning what it meant to be seen, to be respected, and it wasn't easy. It wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about proving to herself that she was worthy of standing in the place she had fought so long to occupy. As she wiped down the counter for the last time that evening, the light from the window cast long shadows across the diner, but it didn't feel like the same shadows. They weren't suffocating anymore. They were just reminders of the work still ahead. But she wasn't afraid anymore. The first week after Ross's departure was the hardest. The weight of the diner seemed to rest heavier on Denise's shoulders with each passing day. The customers still whispered when they thought she wasn't listening, their pity and curiosity thick in the air. Some looked at her with newfound respect, but others simply waited for her to stumble. She could feel the tension, the weight of expectation pressing on her, reminding her that change didn't come easily. Every morning when she stepped through the diner's doors, she felt the eyes on her. They weren't hostile, but they weren't warm either. They were the eyes of people waiting for something, waiting for her to prove that the decision to make her supervisor hadn't been a mistake. It was in those quiet moments, between orders and shifts, that Denise felt the most exposed. Her left hand, still wrapped in bandages, felt like a constant reminder of the accident, of the moment Ross had twisted her wrist. Every time she reached for something, every time she balanced a tray or wiped down a counter, she felt the weakness of the injury and the discomfort of being reminded that she had fought for this job with everything she had. But it was also a reminder that she had fought, and she had won. "How's it feel to be in charge?" Tom asked again one morning, as he watched Denise take a deep breath before approaching a table full of rowdy regulars. She paused, her hand on the back of a chair. "Different," she replied. "But good. You just have to get used to the weight of it." Tom chuckled softly. "Yeah, well, don't let them get to you. You're doing fine." Denise smiled at him, but her thoughts were elsewhere. It was harder than she had anticipated, being the one people looked to for answers. She was used to being the one who carried the weight alone, not the one who had to delegate or make decisions on the fly. Every little thing felt like a test, every small mistake like a crack in the foundation she was trying so hard to build. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, the diner grew quieter. The lunch rush had come and gone, leaving behind only the late afternoon stragglers. Denise walked between the tables, delivering drinks and taking orders, when she noticed a familiar face at the far end of the counter. Harold was sitting there, as always, his coffee mug in front of him. He looked calm, collected, as though the world around him had stopped spinning, but his eyes never left the rhythm of the diner. They were always observant, always aware of every little detail. "How's it going?" Denise asked, her voice light but with an undertone of tension she couldn't quite shake. Harold set down his mug, his gaze steady. "You're doing well. I see you're holding your own." She looked down at the counter, her fingers tracing the edge of a napkin dispenser. I don't feel like I am, she admitted, her voice low. I'm always waiting for someone to say I'm not enough. Harold's eyes softened, a hint of something almost like understanding in his gaze. You've been doing this longer than most of them realize. You've always been enough. You just need to see it. Denise shook her head, her fingers curling into a fist as she leaned against the counter. It's hard, Harold. I'm still the same person I was before. I'm just wearing a new title. You're not the same, Harold replied quietly. And you won't be. You've already changed. They can see it, even if they don't admit it yet. Denise didn't respond. She just watched the steam rise from Harold's coffee mug, her thoughts a whirlwind inside her head. What he said made sense. It was the truth. But she wasn't sure she was ready to fully believe it yet. As she walked back to the kitchen, she caught sight of the door, which had swung open with a soft chime. A new customer, a man with a grim expression, walked in. His presence was different from the others. There was something hard about him, something calculating in the way he moved. He didn't look at anyone, didn't smile as he passed through the door, his eyes only scanning the room with a detached indifference. He chose a booth near the back, his coat pulled tightly around him as he sat down. Denise felt a pang of curiosity. There was something about him that didn't quite fit, but she didn't have the luxury of guessing. She was still running the floor. The evening stretched on, and as the diner emptied, the man in the booth remained, his coffee untouched. Harold was still in his corner watching the scene unfold. The new customer's gaze never left the window, and the tension in his posture was palpable. Denise found herself watching him more than she should have, as though she was waiting for him to make his move. But he never did. Later that night, just as Denise was about to close up, the man stood and walked toward the counter. His steps were slow, deliberate. "How much for a cup of coffee?" he asked, his voice low, almost a murmur. Denise glanced at him, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. But she said nothing as she reached for the pot and filled his cup. $1.50, she replied flatly, meeting his gaze for the first time. The man looked at her for a moment before sliding the exact amount across the counter. As he reached for the door, he paused and turned back toward her. "Don't let them break you," he said quietly, before disappearing into the night. The words hung in the air, echoing like a warning and a promise all at once. Denise's heart skipped a beat as she watched him go. She had no idea who he was or what his words meant, but something in the way he said them felt like the final piece of something she hadn't fully understood yet. It was a message, a reminder that there would always be people watching, waiting, judging, but that didn't mean she had to crumble under the weight of it. She stood there for a moment longer than she should have, staring at the door, before taking a deep breath and turning back to the work that still awaited her. The diner was empty now, save for Harold, who had watched it all unfold in silence. She walked over to his booth, her eyes meeting his with quiet determination. "Thanks for the encouragement, Harold, but I think it's time for me to move forward." Harold's lips curled into the smallest of smiles. "You've been moving forward all along." Denise nodded, a quiet strength filling her chest. The night was dark, but the road ahead of her was clearer than ever. The weeks had begun to blend together in the way the days do when you're no longer just surviving, but beginning to build something new. Denise moved through the motions of her role with growing confidence, her movements more deliberate now, no longer as tentative as they once were. She knew the diner like the back of her hand, the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, the exact placement of every table, the rhythm of the morning rush. But it wasn't just the diner that had changed. Denise had changed too. She found herself standing straighter, walking with a quiet purpose that came from deep within, from somewhere she had buried long ago. She had stopped apologizing for her presence. She had stopped shrinking beneath the weight of everyone else's expectations. It was no longer enough to just be. Now she acted. She made choices. She set boundaries, and she made her voice heard. and people noticed. At first, the staff had been unsure. They watched her from the periphery, skeptical of the new dynamic, uncertain of how long it would last. But as time passed, they began to accept it. One by one, they began to listen to her instructions, to respect her decisions. Tom, who had always been a quiet presence in the diner, had started to open up more. He'd become an ally, someone she could lean on when the weight of it all felt too much. And then there was Harold, steadfast as ever, but his gaze always lingering on her in that way that made her feel like she was more than just the waitress with the broken hand. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the lull between the lunch and dinner crowds, when Denise caught a glimpse of a familiar face at the counter. It was him again, the man who had come in a few nights ago, the one who had given her that cryptic piece of advice. This time he wasn't just passing through. He sat in his usual spot near the window, his coat still tightly wrapped around his body, though the weather had warmed. He had a presence that was hard to ignore, a calm that made everything around him seem to settle, as if he were the eye of the storm. Denise hesitated for only a moment before walking over to him, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She wasn't sure why, but something about him felt like a puzzle she was supposed to solve. "Back again?" she said, her tone casual, though there was an edge of curiosity underneath. The man looked up at her, his eyes sharp, but there was a kindness there that hadn't been there the first time. "Can't stay away from a good cup of coffee," he said, his voice low but warm. "And I thought I'd see how you're doing." Denise raised an eyebrow. "You've been keeping track of me?" He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I'm just paying attention." She studied him for a moment. There was something about the way he spoke, the way his words seemed to carry more weight than they should, that piqued her interest. "That advice you gave me, it was kind of out of the blue," she said. "Don't let them break me? What did you mean by that?" The man's eyes flickered for a moment, and Denise caught a glint of something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't sadness or regret, but something deeper, something buried. "I've been where you are," he said after a beat. "I've seen people like you. People who work harder than anyone else, who do everything they're told, and still get the short end of the stick. It's easy to let the world convince you that you're not enough, that your effort doesn't matter. But the truth is, it's the ones who keep going, no matter what, who win in the end." Denise felt a flicker of something in her chest. He was right. She had been that person for so long, the one who kept her head down, who worked harder than anyone, who always pushed through the pain and the rejection. And yet, she had never really seen herself as anything other than what others had labeled her. Now, though, she felt something new. The shift had been subtle, but undeniable. She was no longer fighting to be seen. She was already visible. "You sound like you've been through some stuff yourself," she said, leaning against the counter, her voice softer now. The man nodded, the lines on his face deepening slightly. "I've learned a lot from those who've come before me. I've learned that sometimes the best thing you can do is just keep your head down and do the work. But sometimes," he said, his voice tightening, "you have to stand up and claim what's yours. And that's what I'm trying to do now." Denise's eyes flickered toward the kitchen door, her mind racing. "Claim what's yours," she echoed quietly. There was a weight to his words that felt like a call to action. And suddenly, Denise knew that this wasn't just about the diner. This wasn't just about a job or a title. This was about her life. It was about taking control of the narrative that had been written for her, the one where she was always the underdog, always the one who had to prove herself. But she didn't have to prove anything anymore. She straightened, looking him in the eye. "You're right," she said softly. "It's time I claimed what's mine." The man gave her a sharp, almost approving nod. "Good. Don't forget that. No one else will give it to you. You've got to take it." And just like that, something clicked inside her. It wasn't just a realization. It was a decision. She wasn't going to wait for permission. She wasn't going to wait for someone to tell her she was ready. She was ready now. "Thanks," she said, her voice steady. "For the advice, and for reminding me." The man tipped his head in acknowledgement, then stood, slipping his coat on as he moved toward the door. "Good luck," he said, his voice low. "You're going to need it." Denise watched him go, the sound of the door chiming softly as he stepped into the night. The weight of his words lingered in her mind, settling deep within her chest. For the first time in a long time, Denise didn't feel the need to look back. The past was behind her, and the future was unfolding in front of her, waiting for her to claim it. As she turned back to the counter, her eyes met Harold's, who had watched the entire exchange from his usual booth. His gaze was knowing, but there was a flicker of something else there too, something that felt like pride. "Time to step up?" he asked, his voice a quiet murmur. Denise nodded, her smile genuine now. "Yeah, it's time." And for the first time, she truly believed it. The morning light streamed through the diner's front windows, casting long shadows across the floor. It was early enough that the diner was still quiet, the usual hum of activity just beginning to take hold. Denise stood at the counter, wiping it down methodically, her movements calm, almost meditative. The bandages on her hand were gone now, replaced with a soft, protective wrap, but the ache was still there, a constant reminder of the past that refused to be erased. Yet today, the pain felt different. Today, it was simply part of her story. The door opened with its familiar chime, and Denise glanced up instinctively. She had grown accustomed to the daily rush, the flood of faces, the constant need for her attention. But today, something in her gut told her that today was going to be different. She was right. Harold, seated in his usual corner booth, gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. But his eyes were sharp, watching the door, waiting. He was always watching, but today his gaze held a quiet intensity that sent a ripple of unease through Denise. She didn't know why, but the air in the diner felt heavier today, thick with expectation. The man who had been coming in and out of the diner over the past few weeks entered again, the same grim expression on his face. He was wearing the same coat, the same quiet demeanor that seemed to fill the room without him having to say a word. This time, though, something had changed. He didn't look around the room as he usually did. He walked straight toward the counter and slid into the seat, his movements deliberate. Denise swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She had no idea why, but she felt a strange sense of urgency in her chest, a feeling that something was about to happen that would change everything. "Coffee," he said, his voice low, rough around the edges. His eyes met hers, as if he had been waiting for her to notice him, to see him. She poured the coffee with practiced ease, setting it in front of him without a word. The man stared into his cup for a long moment, his fingers resting lightly on the rim. There was something else in his posture now, something that spoke of weariness, of a burden too heavy to bear alone. "You've been here every day this week," Denise said quietly, breaking the silence between them. "What is it you're really looking for?" He looked up at her then, and for the first time, there was something vulnerable in his eyes, a flicker of something raw that he hadn't shown before. "I'm not looking for anything," he said quietly. "But I'm starting to think you are." Denise tilted her head, uncertainty creeping into her voice. "What do you mean?" The man sighed, leaning back in his seat as he studied her. His expression was more open now, but still guarded. "You're not like the others here," he said. "I see it in the way you carry yourself. You've got a fire that most people are too afraid to show. The way they treat you, it's not right, but you've got something in you that they can't take away. I just wanted to see if you'd notice." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach, knocking the wind out of her. She had always known, deep down, that she wasn't the same as the others. She had always known that her fight wasn't just about surviving, but about standing up for herself, for what she was worth. But hearing someone else say it, someone who had been watching from the sidelines, someone who had noticed, was different. Denise's breath caught in her chest. "I've been fighting for so long. I'm not sure how much more I can take." The man's gaze softened, but there was a hardness in his eyes, too. "You've already taken more than anyone should. But that's why you're going to make it. You don't stop. You keep going, even when they try to push you down." Denise stood still, her mind racing. She didn't know why this man, this stranger, had chosen today to speak to her like this. But something in his words resonated with her. She felt a sense of clarity, like something was shifting within her, something she couldn't ignore. The sound of the door opening broke the silence again, and Denise turned to see a group of customers walk in. The usual morning rush was beginning, but she didn't feel the weight of it like she had before. She didn't feel the need to retreat, to blend into the background. She stood taller now, more aware of the power she held, the choices she had yet to make. Harold's voice interrupted her thoughts. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for," he said, his words quiet, but heavy with meaning. "You've always been." Denise met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't just observant. It was respect. It was the same respect she had been fighting for all along, the same respect she was starting to understand she had already earned. The man at the counter stood, his coffee finished, and nodded at her before turning toward the door. "Take care of yourself," he said quietly. "Don't let them take it from you." Denise watched him leave, his figure disappearing into the morning light. The words lingered in her mind, echoing through the diner like a quiet warning and a promise all at once. Harold was still watching her, his gaze never leaving her face. She could feel the weight of his quiet approval, the unspoken understanding that had passed between them. It wasn't just about the diner anymore. It was about her life. And for the first time, she was ready to live it. The morning rush came and went, and as the hours ticked by, Denise moved through the diner with a new sense of purpose. She no longer felt the need to apologize for being there. She no longer felt the weight of their judgment. She was a force now, a quiet, steady presence that was impossible to ignore. By the end of the shift, as the last customers left and the din of the diner began to fade, Denise stood at the counter, her hands resting on the surface. The lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the room, but it didn't feel like the shadows of the past anymore. They were just shadows, fleeting and transient. Harold slid out of his booth, his movements deliberate. He stood beside her, his presence solid and unwavering. "You've got this," he said simply. Denise nodded, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think I do." And for the first time, she truly believed it. The days had become a blur of motion, a continuous rhythm that pulsed through the diner like the steady beat of a drum. The work hadn't changed much, but Denise had. Each time she stepped into the diner, she carried herself differently, more aware, more present. The weight of past mistakes, of being overlooked and ignored, was still there, but it didn't define her anymore. She had learned to move through it, to let it pass over her without letting it anchor her to a past she no longer needed. It was just past noon when the door opened again, and the usual chime echoed through the diner. This time, Denise didn't turn to look right away. She didn't need to. She was starting to feel the pulse of the diner, the ebb and flow of the people who passed through it, the way their energy mingled with hers. But then she heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and something in her gut told her to look. It was Ross. He stood in the doorway, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the room with the same coldness she had seen before, the same arrogance, the same belief that he was untouchable. He hadn't been back since the day Harold had exposed him. and Denise had thought she would never see him again. But here he was, stepping into the diner like he owned it again. The room seemed to freeze, time slowing as he walked toward the counter. Customers stopped talking. The buzz of the diner faded. There was no mistaking the presence he carried with him. Even without saying a word, Ross commanded attention. His eyes locked onto Denise's as he slid onto the stool at the counter. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't look away. She stood still, her back straight, her hands steady. This wasn't the woman who had once been afraid of him. This wasn't the woman who had quietly taken the blame for things that weren't hers to carry. This was the woman who had stood up, who had claimed her place. Ross didn't speak at first. He just watched her, waiting, as though expecting some kind of reaction. Denise didn't give him one. She took a deep breath, then walked over to him, her steps measured. Her heart was pounding, but she wasn't going to let him see it. Not now. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice calm, her eyes steady. Ross sneered, his lip curling into the same condescending smirk he had always worn. "Coffee," he muttered. "Black." Denise didn't flinch. She poured the coffee with practiced ease, placing the cup in front of him without a word. She was acutely aware of the weight of his gaze, but she refused to let it affect her. She could feel the others watching too, the customers who had been here for the past few weeks, the regulars who had come to know her as more than just the quiet waitress. They were watching to see how she would handle this moment. She didn't make a scene. She didn't confront him in front of everyone. Instead, she did what she had always done. She worked. She carried herself with quiet authority, doing her job and ignoring the past. Ross took a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving her face. "You think you've won, don't you?" he asked after a moment, his voice low, almost amused. "You think everything's changed because you're wearing that new title, playing pretend like you're in charge of something?" Denise's gaze didn't waver. "No," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not pretending. I am in charge." His laugh was short, bitter. "You think you can just sweep things under the rug, huh? Think you can pretend that none of it ever happened?" Denise's hand tightened around the cloth she had been wiping the counter with, but she didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth was clear, even to him. "You don't get it," Ross continued, his tone colder now. "I've run this place. I made it what it is. And you? You're nothing without me." Denise looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She could feel the eyes of the room on them, but she didn't care. This wasn't about them. This was about her. She took a step back, her voice calm as she replied, "I don't need you to make anything for me, Ross. I've been making it on my own for a long time now." The words landed between them like a final blow. Ross stared at her, his face darkening with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He hadn't expected her to say it. He hadn't expected her to stand her ground. He opened his mouth to say something more, but the sound of the door opening again interrupted him. This time, it was the sound of the police. 2 officers walked in, their presence commanding and unmistakable. Harold was at the counter before Ross could even react, his expression hard and unyielding. He stepped between Ross and Denise, his eyes locking onto Ross with a level of calm that spoke volumes. "Leave," Harold said quietly, his voice low but laced with authority. Ross blinked, his expression shifting from anger to confusion. "What?" "I said leave," Harold repeated, his gaze unwavering. "You're done here." Ross opened his mouth to argue, but one of the officers stepped forward, their eyes sharp and professional. "We've been asked to escort you out. You've overstayed your welcome." Ross's face turned a shade of pale white as the officers moved in, their hands firmly grasping his arms. He struggled for a moment, his voice rising in defiance, but there was no power in it anymore. The room had already shifted. It had already recognized the truth. The officers escorted him out, his protests growing faint as the door closed behind him. The diner stood in stunned silence, but it didn't last long. As the door clicked shut, the tension in the air lifted, replaced by a quiet relief that swept through the room. Denise stood frozen, watching the door as the last echoes of Ross's protests faded away. It was over. It had been over for some time now, but this moment, this final moment, marked the end of a chapter. The diner was hers now. She turned back to face the room. The customers, the staff, everyone was watching her. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the weight of their gazes not as judgment, but as recognition. Harold nodded toward her, his face unreadable but his eyes steady. "Well done," he said, his voice calm but thick with meaning. Denise stood taller, her chest swelling with a quiet pride. She wasn't the woman who had walked in here months ago, afraid of being overlooked. She wasn't the woman who had been broken by the weight of a job she didn't ask for. She was someone else now, someone who had earned her place, someone who had taken what was rightfully hers. She had claimed it, and no one could take it from her. The diner had never felt quieter, yet there was a new sense of belonging in the air. Denise moved through it like she always had, but now there was a subtle difference. The way people looked at her, the way they spoke to her. There was respect now, where there had once been pity or indifference. It was a feeling she had chased for so long, a feeling that seemed just out of reach, but now it was hers, firmly in her grasp. The days that followed Ross's departure were not without their challenges. The shift in power left behind a vacuum, and with it came a few rocky moments. The staff, though loyal, had been hesitant. They had worked under Ross's oppressive thumb for so long that they weren't sure how to function without it. But Denise wasn't like him. She didn't rule with fear. She led with consistency, with the quiet strength that had always defined her. She gave them space to adjust, but she made sure they knew the new standard. She wasn't here to be their friend. She was here to be the leader they needed. It was a Tuesday when the real test came. The dinner rush had started, and the diner was packed as usual. The clatter of plates, the hum of conversation, the sizzle of the grill, it all blended together in the familiar, comforting chaos. Denise was moving from one task to another, checking in with the cooks, refilling drinks, handling customer requests with ease. But then she heard a voice, sharp and demanding, cutting through the noise. "I need to speak to the manager," a man's voice barked from a corner booth. Denise didn't hesitate. She had learned long ago that hesitation was the enemy of control. She stepped forward, her expression calm, her posture straight. "I'm the manager," she said, her voice cool but steady. The man looked up, his eyes scanning her, taking in her uniform, the apron tied neatly around her waist. "You?" The surprise in his voice was evident. "I need to speak to someone who's actually in charge." The words stung, but Denise didn't let them show. She met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "I am in charge. What seems to be the problem?" He scoffed, leaning back in his seat, his arms crossed. "I've been waiting for my food for over 30 minutes. This is ridiculous. Who's running this place?" The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the whole diner seemed to fall silent. Every eye was on her, watching, waiting for how she would respond. Denise took a slow breath, keeping her emotions in check. "I'll check on your order," she said, her voice calm, but her eyes hardening with the weight of his disrespect. "But let me be clear. You're not going to speak to me like that. Not here." The man's face turned red with irritation, but before he could open his mouth to argue, Denise was already walking toward the kitchen. The tension followed her every step. The kitchen was alive with energy, chefs moving quickly, the rhythm of their work never faltering. But when Denise entered, the clattering of pans slowed. They all looked up, waiting for her to speak. "Get this man's order out now," she said, her voice crisp but controlled. "And make it fast." The cooks nodded, their respect for her evident in the quickness with which they moved to get the order done. The heat of the kitchen was suffocating, But Denise stood there, unmoving, until the order was completed. When she returned to the counter, the man was still seated, his arms crossed, tapping his foot impatiently. "Your order is on its way," she said as she slid the plate in front of him, her gaze never leaving his. "And I'd appreciate it if you treated the staff here with more respect in the future." He opened his mouth to argue, but Denise was already walking away. She didn't need his apology. She didn't need him to understand. She needed him to leave. The rest of the shift went smoothly, but Denise's mind kept drifting back to that moment. She had stood her ground. She hadn't let his words break her. And for the first time, she had truly felt like the manager. Not just a replacement for Ross, but someone who had earned her place through action. As the night wound down, the diner began to empty, the clattering of plates and silverware fading into the background. Denise took a moment to breathe, the exhaustion settling deep in her bones. She looked around, seeing the staff begin to wind down, the tension from earlier evaporating. The night had been a success, both in terms of the diner running smoothly and in terms of her proving to herself that she could handle anything that came her way. Harold had been watching from his usual booth, as he always did. He didn't say anything at first, but when Denise walked past him, he gave her a small, approving nod. "You did good today," he said quietly. Denise smiled, but it wasn't a smile of relief. It was a smile of recognition of the person she had become. "I'm not done yet," she replied, her voice steady with the conviction that had been growing inside her. "But I'm getting there." Harold's gaze softened, and he nodded, his eyes filled with something like pride. "You've already earned your place here. Don't forget that." Denise looked out across the diner, seeing it as if for the first time. This was hers now, and nothing, no one, was going to take it away from her. The door opened again, the soft chime ringing through the diner. A new customer stepped in, and Denise automatically moved to greet them. Her posture was straight, her expression professional but warm. As she took their order, she realized that this was the first time in a long time she hadn't felt the weight of the world pressing on her shoulders. The weight had shifted. It was no longer a burden. It was her strength. And as she walked back to the kitchen, she knew one thing for certain. The world would never break her again. Not now. Not ever.